100,000 men waited inside a mountain of tunnels 17 miles long, behind hundreds of coastal guns, on an island America chose never to attack. Not because the strongest fortress in the entire Pacific could not be broken, because breaking it was never going to be worth the cost. Somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 American lives, that was the estimate for taking Rabaul by force. More blood than an island the size of a small American county had any right to demand. So America walked away. It left the mountain standing, left the tunnels sealed, left the guns pointed at an enemy that stopped coming. For 2 years, those 100,000 men waited for a battle that had already been erased from the plan. They were told reinforcements were on the way. They were told the empire needed them exactly where they stood. None of it was true. What happened inside that abandoned fortress, the hunger, the silence, the slow unraveling of every promise they had been given, is one of the most devastating stories the Pacific War ever produced, and almost nobody has heard it. This is the story of the men Japan sent to hold ground that stopped mattering, and the war that simply forgot to come back for them. In January of 1942, the Australian garrison at Rabaul knew the Japanese fleet was coming days before it arrived, and there was nothing they could do about it. Fewer than 2,000 men, poorly equipped, poorly supplied, stood between the largest natural harbor in the southwestern Pacific and an invasion force built to take it in a single stroke. The Japanese landed before dawn on the 23rd of January. By the time the sun was fully up, organized resistance had collapsed. Survivors scattered into the jungle of New Britain, some walking for weeks to escape, many never escaping at all, sleeping in the mud beneath the canopy, listening for engines that meant the enemy had found them again. What Japan seized that morning was not simply a colonial outpost. It was one of the finest anchorages on Earth, and the men who took it understood immediately what they were holding. The town itself had been small, a handful of streets, a scattering of colonial buildings baking under equatorial heat, ringed by 2 active volcanoes that occasionally dusted the rooftops in fine gray ash. Locals had lived for generations with the low rumble of Tavurvur and Vulcan in the background, a reminder that the ground beneath the harbor was never entirely still. To the soldiers who marched in that January morning, the volcanoes were not a threat. They were terrain, and terrain in the hands of a disciplined army was opportunity. Simpson Harbor curved into the base of 2 volcanoes, deep enough and sheltered enough that a fleet of warships could sit at anchor, almost invisible from the open sea. The surrounding terrain did the rest of the work. Volcanic ridges rose in every direction, cut through with ravines and dense jungle that turned every approach into a natural killing ground. A defender here did not need overwhelming numbers. The ground itself was the weapon. Japanese planners looked at the harbor, looked at the terrain, and understood they had found something rare in modern warfare, a position that could be held by a fraction of the force it would take to capture. They began building immediately, and they built with an urgency that revealed exactly how much value they placed on what they now controlled. Over the following 18 months, Rabaul was transformed. Engineers blasted into the volcanic rock surrounding the harbor, carving tunnels deep enough to shelter aircraft, fuel stores, ammunition depots, hospitals, and command posts from anything an enemy bomber could drop on them. By the time the network was finished, it stretched more than 17 miles beneath the surface of the peninsula, a hidden city built entirely to survive. Above ground, 4 separate airfields rose out of the jungle, each capable of servicing squadrons of fighters and bombers simultaneously. Ground crews worked through the tropical heat and the sudden afternoon downpours that swept in off the strait, patching runways pitted by early raids, fueling aircraft under camouflage netting strung between the palms. Coastal artillery batteries were positioned along every approach to the harbor, sited with enough overlapping coverage that no ship could enter or leave without passing beneath their guns. Anti-aircraft positions ringed the perimeter in numbers dense enough that American bomber crews, the first time they flew over Rabaul, understood within minutes why this target was different from anything else in the theater. The sky over the harbor filled with flak so thick that pilots said afterward they could have walked across it. Black bursts stacking on top of each other until the formations flying through them could barely see the aircraft on either wing. Rabaul earned a reputation among American air crews as the single most dangerous target in the entire Pacific War. A place where a bombing run meant flying through a wall of fire that never seemed to thin no matter how many missions were flown against it. Inside the tunnels themselves, the air stayed cool and damp year-round, a relief from the equatorial heat above, though the smell of oil, wet stone, and unwashed men never fully left the passages. Engineers who had spent months blasting through volcanic rock knew every turn by memory, every chamber built for a specific purpose, ammunition here, fuel there, a hospital ward carved deep enough that even a direct hit on the surface would barely register as a tremor below. Soldiers moved through the network like a second city built underground, one that never saw daylight and never needed to. The man given command of this fortress in late 1942 was Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, a veteran officer who had led the campaign that seized Java only months earlier, watching an entire Dutch colonial defense collapse in a matter of days. Imamura arrived at Rabaul to find a garrison already swelling past anything he had commanded before, and it kept growing. Army infantry units arrived by convoy. Naval aviation personnel filled the airfields with fighters and bombers. Construction battalions kept expanding the tunnel network deeper into the mountain. Medical staff, supply troops, engineers, anti-aircraft crews, all of it converged on this single peninsula, until the number under Imamura's command reached approximately 100,000 men, the largest concentration of Japanese military strength anywhere outside the Chinese mainland itself. Imamura understood what he had been given. Rabaul was not simply a defensive position. It was the anchor of everything Japan did in the southwestern Pacific. Every convoy moving troops and supplies toward the Solomon Islands passed through or near the harbor. Every air operation flown over New Guinea launched from or refueled at one of the 4 airfields. Every naval movement in the region depended in some way on the protection and support that Rabaul provided. Take away Rabaul, and the entire Japanese position in the southwestern Pacific lost its spine. Every officer who studied the map understood this, on both sides of the conflict. Which is exactly why, by the summer of 1943, American planners were doing the math on what it would actually cost to take it. The numbers did not offer much comfort. Estimates for a direct assault on Rabaul ranged from 30,000 to 50,000 American casualties, a figure built from hard experience rather than guesswork. Earlier that same year, American forces had learned exactly what a heavily fortified Japanese position could do to an attacking force even on ground far smaller and far less formidable than Rabaul. The volcanic ridges, the layered artillery, the 17 miles of tunnels sheltering defenders from bombardment, the 4 airfields capable of contesting the sky over any landing beach. All of it pointed toward a battle that would grind on for months and bleed an attacking army in ways that no American commander wanted to explain to the families waiting at home. For the 100,000 men inside the perimeter, none of this uncertainty mattered yet. What mattered was the fortress itself, the sense of purpose that came with holding the most heavily defended position Japan had built outside its home islands. Soldiers manned coastal guns that could sink a battleship before it came within range of the harbor mouth. Pilots scrambled from airfields carved out of jungle that had not existed 2 years earlier. Engineers who had spent months blasting tunnels into volcanic rock could look at what they had built and feel, correctly, that they had created something almost impossible to break by force. Letters home from that period, the ones that survived, describe a garrison confident to the point of pride. Young soldiers wrote of the harbor at dawn, mist rising off the water while the volcanoes stood silent in the background, of evenings spent listening to the distant surf beyond the reef, of the strange comfort in knowing that whatever came next, they stood behind guns and tunnels that no enemy had managed to break anywhere else in the Pacific. It was, for many of them, the closest thing to safety that the war had offered since it began. None of them yet understood how completely that safety depended on an enemy choosing to test it. Imamura walked the perimeter of his command in those early months and saw an army at the height of its confidence, a garrison that believed, with good reason, that it occupied the single most defensible position in the entire Pacific theater. He had commanded men before, in Java, where an entire colonial defense had folded within days against a well-planned assault, and he understood better than most officers in the region what a fortified position could withstand when it was built correctly. Rabaul, in his judgment, and in the judgment of every engineer and gunnery officer under his command, had been built correctly. They had guns enough to challenge any fleet, tunnels deep enough to survive any bombardment, and numbers large enough to man every position simultaneously. What none of them yet understood, not the newest private manning and anti-aircraft gun, not the pilots flying patrols over the harbor, not even Imamura himself in those first months of command, was that the fortress they had built to withstand the greatest assault in the Pacific War was about to face something they had no training and no doctrine to prepare them for. Not an attack, the absence of one, an enemy who looked at everything they had built, all 17 miles of tunnels, all 4 airfields, all 100,000 men standing ready, and decided none of it was worth fighting for. There is a particular kind of dread that comes from preparing endlessly for a test that never arrives, and in the summer of 1943, the men of Rabaul had not yet learned it. They still believed the coming months would bring the fight they had built their fortress to win. Drills continued. Guns were cleaned and recalibrated. Tunnels were extended further into the mountain, as though depth alone could answer whatever the Americans eventually decided to send against them. Nobody inside the perimeter, from the lowest private to Imamura himself, could have imagined that the answer had already been decided, and that it would not involve a single shot fired at the fortress they had spent 18 months perfecting. The men of Rabaul had spent 18 months preparing for a battle. Across the water, in conference rooms they would never see, other men were already deciding that battle would never come. In August of 1943, while the garrison at Rabaul continued extending tunnels and recalibrating guns for a battle they believed was coming, a group of American and British planners gathered in Quebec to decide what that battle would actually look like. The original strategy, built around General Douglas MacArthur's broader Pacific campaign, had always assumed that Rabaul would eventually have to be taken directly. It was the keystone of Japanese power in the entire southwestern Pacific. Every convoy moving troops toward the Solomon Islands passed near it. Every air operation over New Guinea depended on contesting the airspace it controlled. In the military logic that had governed the war since its opening months, an enemy stronghold of that size, sitting directly across the path of an advancing army, had to be neutralized by force before that army could safely move forward. That was the doctrine every officer in the room had trained under. It was also, MacArthur had come to believe, wrong. The evidence that changed his mind had been accumulating for almost a year, written in the casualty reports coming out of Guadalcanal and the early fighting through the Solomon Islands chain. Every position the Japanese had fortified and defended to the last man had cost the attacking American forces dearly, sometimes disproportionately, for ground that, in many cases, turned out to have limited lasting value once it was finally secured. At the same time, American naval and air power was growing in a way that offered a different kind of answer entirely. If a fortified position could be cut off from supply, stripped of its aircraft, and rendered incapable of threatening American operations elsewhere, did it actually matter how many enemy soldiers remained inside it? MacArthur's argument, the one he carried into the planning sessions and the one that eventually reshaped Allied strategy for the rest of the Pacific War, was simple and in its own way brutal. Rabaul did not need to be captured. It needed to be made irrelevant. 100,000 Japanese soldiers sitting inside a fortress with no ships to carry them anywhere, no aircraft to contest the skies above them, and no supply line reliable enough to sustain offensive operations were not a threat requiring elimination. They were a burden that Japan itself would have to feed, arm, and worry about indefinitely, while American forces advanced toward targets that actually mattered. There was a particular kind of discomfort in that argument, one that some officers in the room were reluctant to say aloud even as they came to accept it. Military doctrine had always measured success in ground taken, positions captured, enemy forces destroyed or forced to surrender. What MacArthur was proposing instead was a kind of victory that produced no captured flag, no surrender ceremony, no clear moment when anyone could point to a map and say the position had fallen. It would look, from the outside, almost like nothing had happened at all. An enemy fortress would simply sit there, unconquered and unconquerable by force, while the war moved past it entirely. For men trained to think in terms of decisive battles, that kind of victory took some getting used to. But the casualty numbers made the argument for themselves in a way that abstract doctrine never could. The number that helped settle the argument came from a battle that had nothing to do with Rabaul at all. That same November, American Marines assaulted the tiny coral atoll of Tarawa, a speck of land barely large enough to hold an airstrip, and lost nearly 1,000 men killed in 76 hours of fighting against a garrison a fraction the size of Rabaul's. Rabaul was not a coral atoll. It was volcanic ridges and 17 miles of tunnels and 4 operational airfields and coastal guns sited to cover every possible landing beach. If Tarawa cost 1,000 American lives in 3 days, the planners in Quebec did not need an elaborate model to understand what a direct assault on Rabaul would cost. The Joint Chiefs approved the revised strategy. Rabaul would be isolated, its air and naval capability destroyed through sustained bombardment, and then simply left behind as American forces advanced elsewhere. The garrison inside would be allowed to survive as best it could on whatever supplies managed to slip through an Allied blockade that would tighten with every passing month. For the 100,000 men who had built their fortress to withstand history's greatest siege, the decision made in Quebec amounted to a sentence handed down without a trial and without an appeal. Nobody at Rabaul had been asked. Nobody at Rabaul would be told the full truth of what had been decided, not for a long time, and in some ways not ever in terms that matched the reality of their situation. The isolation did not arrive as a single dramatic event. It arrived in stages, each one a little harder to explain away than the last. Each one leaving the garrison a little more certain that something fundamental had shifted, even as the official version of events continued describing their position as vital and temporary. The first stage was air. Beginning in late 1943, American and Australian aircraft began systematic attacks on Rabaul's airfields, not attempting to destroy the fortress itself, an impossible task given the tunnel network and the terrain, but targeting the aircraft that gave the base its ability to strike back and to contest the sky above the surrounding region. The air battles that November were among the most intense fought anywhere in the Pacific War, and the losses on both sides reflected exactly how much value each side placed on controlling that airspace. Japanese losses grew severe enough that the combined fleet made the decision to withdraw its carrier air groups from Rabaul entirely, pulling out the aircraft that represented the most capable offensive force still stationed there, rather than watch them destroyed in a battle of attrition they could no longer win. By February of 1944, the 4 airfields that had once symbolized the fortress's offensive reach stood physically intact and almost entirely useless, runways, with nothing left worth flying off them. For the pilots who were left when the carrier air groups withdrew, the change was immediate and visible in a way that no official announcement could have matched. Squadrons that had once filled the runways at dawn, engines turning over in the gray half-light before a patrol, dwindled to a handful of aircraft, then to fewer still. Ground crews who had spent months keeping fighters airworthy under difficult conditions found themselves with less and less to maintain, standing beside empty revetments that had been built to shelter machines that were no longer coming back. The silence over the airfields, where the roar of engines had once been constant, became its own kind of evidence, one that nobody needed to explain to be understood. The second stage was naval, and it moved slower but cut deeper. American submarines intensified operations against the shipping lanes that connected Rabaul to the rest of the Japanese supply network, hunting the transports and destroyers that tried to run food, fuel, and ammunition into the harbor. Every ship that attempted the run took a greater risk than the one before it, and the losses climbed to a point that Japan could not sustain indefinitely, not for a garrison whose strategic value had already been quietly written off in Allied planning documents an ocean away. By the middle of 1944, the tonnage actually reaching Rabaul had fallen to a fraction of what 100,000 men required simply to maintain their existing strength. And even that reduced amount came at a cost in ships and crews that grew harder to justify with every convoy that failed to arrive. Dock workers at Simpson Harbor, who had once unloaded crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and rice on a schedule regular enough to plan around, found the intervals between ships stretching from weeks into months. When a vessel did make it through, word spread across the peninsula quickly, men gathering at the waterfront to help unload whatever had survived the run, grateful for a delivery that a year earlier would have been considered barely adequate and now felt like a windfall. The harbor that had once been able to shelter an entire combined fleet sat mostly empty, its deep sheltered water no longer protecting warships, but a handful of small craft and fishing boats that had become, in their own quiet way, more essential to the garrison's survival than any destroyer. The third stage required no ships and no aircraft at all. It was simply geography. As American forces under MacArthur leapfrogged up the New Guinea coast, seizing key airfields and supply points while deliberately bypassing Japanese strongpoints wherever the terrain allowed it, and as Admiral Chester Nimitz drove a parallel campaign through the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, and eventually the Marianas, Rabaul did not move an inch, but the war around it did. Hollandia fell in April of 1944. The Vogelkop Peninsula was secured by July. American forces were positioning for the return to the Philippines by October. Each advance put another few hundred miles between Rabaul and anything resembling the front line of the war it had been built to fight. The fortress had not been defeated. It had simply been left behind, stranded in a pocket of Japanese-held territory that mattered to nobody anymore, not to the Americans who had already moved past it, and increasingly not even to the high command in Tokyo, which had bigger and more urgent losses to manage as the war contracted steadily back toward the home islands. Imamura understood the shape of this reality faster and more completely than almost anyone else inside the perimeter. By the middle of 1944, the airfields were neutralized, the harbor could no longer support any operation of consequence, and the supply situation was deteriorating in ways that no amount of local ingenuity could fully offset over the long term. He had spent his career inside a military culture that prized discipline, hierarchy, and unwavering resolve above almost everything else, and that same culture made it nearly impossible for him to communicate the full weight of what he understood to the men serving under him in terms that matched the actual situation. So the garrison was told what garrisons in that position were always told, that they were conducting a strategic holding operation of great importance to the empire, that reinforcement and relief were being planned and would arrive once conditions permitted it. Officers repeated these assurances in briefings and inspections, some of them believing what they said because the alternative was unthinkable, others understanding by then that they were repeating a story that had stopped being true months earlier. What the men could not be told officially, they began to piece together for themselves, because the evidence was impossible to hide entirely, no matter how carefully the official version was maintained. The supply ships stopped arriving on anything resembling a schedule. The aircraft that had once filled all 4 runways thinned out over weeks, rather than disappearing all at once, which somehow made the loss harder to name, harder to point to, as a single moment when everything changed. The air raids that had once come almost daily grew less frequent, then rare, not because the Americans had decided to spare the garrison, but because there was nothing left inside the perimeter worth the fuel and the risk to send bombers after. Each of these small observations became a piece of a larger picture that the men assembled quietly among themselves, in barracks and mess lines and tunnel passages, long before anyone in a position of authority was willing to say the words out loud. By the end of 1944, most of the garrison understood, in the way soldiers always eventually understand the things nobody will confirm for them, that the war they had trained to fight was not coming back for them, and that whatever happened next would depend entirely on their own ability to survive, rather than on any relief column crossing the horizon. The men who felt the tightening blockade most directly were not the officers reading strategic assessments in briefing rooms, but the ordinary soldiers standing in ration lines that grew shorter with each passing month. A private who had arrived at Rabaul in 1942, remembering rice served in generous portions, fish and vegetables supplementing the standard ration, watched over 2 years as the servings shrank, as substitutes replaced staples, as meals that had once been unremarkable became something men thought about and rationed mentally long before the food itself ran short. Hunger, in the early stages, was manageable, even routine, the kind of discomfort soldiers everywhere learned to tolerate. It was the trajectory that unsettled men more than the hunger itself, the slow and unmistakable sense that whatever this month's ration looked like, next month's would almost certainly be smaller. Survival, stripped down to its most basic arithmetic, was a brutal calculation. A Japanese soldier in the field required roughly 600 calories a day from official rations alone just to maintain minimal operational effectiveness, a number supplemented in normal circumstances by whatever additional food a functioning supply chain could provide. 100,000 men at that baseline required 60 million calories every single day. Over 2 years of isolation, that added up to something in the neighborhood of 43 billion calories that the garrison needed to find from somewhere, because the ships that were supposed to provide it were no longer coming. The blockade had made the math impossible to solve through supply alone. It could only be solved, if it could be solved at all, by transforming the fortress itself into something it had never been designed to be. What the garrison built in response constitutes one of the more remarkable and least remembered organizational achievements to come out of the entire Pacific War. Entire battalions that had trained for years in combined arms tactics were redirected wholesale into agricultural production, not as a supplementary task squeezed in around military duties, but as their primary function. Infantry officers who had studied assault tactics and fire coordination spent their days instead supervising the cultivation of sweet potatoes and taro in soil that had never been farmed before, converted plot by plot from jungle and volcanic ash into something that could keep 100,000 men alive. Soldiers who had trained to fight at sea took to the waters around the peninsula in small boats repurposed from military use, fishing the reefs and channels for anything that could supplement the shrinking ration. Engineers who had spent 18 months blasting tunnels into volcanic rock turned their skills toward building irrigation channels, terracing hillsides, constructing pens for the pigs and chickens that soon spread across sections of the base that had once been purely military ground. The fields themselves told their own story to anyone who walked the peninsula in those months, where dense jungle had once crowded right up against the airstrips and gun emplacements. Cleared plots now stretched in careful rows, sweet potato vines climbing over mounded earth, taro planted in the damp, low ground near the streams that ran down from the volcanic ridges. Men worked these fields in the same uniforms they had worn to build tunnels and man artillery pieces, sweat soaking through fabric never designed for agricultural labor, hands that had trained to grip rifles growing calloused instead from hoes and irrigation shovels. The volcanic soil, once it was properly worked, proved more fertile than anyone had expected, a small mercy in a situation otherwise defined by scarcity, though even generous soil could not fully close the gap between what the garrison could grow and what 100,000 men actually needed to eat. The transformation touched every part of the garrison's daily life. Roll calls that had once organized men for drills and inspections now organized them for planting schedules and harvest rotations. Medical staff who had trained to treat combat wounds spent increasing amounts of their time managing malnutrition and the tropical diseases that spread more easily through a population whose diet had grown thin and inconsistent. The engineering corps that had built the most sophisticated underground fortress in the Pacific now applied that same precision to something as unglamorous and as essential as keeping a sweet potato crop alive through the wet season. By any measure that mattered to the men actually living it, what Rabaul had become by the second half of 1944 was not a military operation in any conventional sense. It was a society built out of necessity, sustained by improvisation, and entirely uncertain of its own future. The psychological weight of that transformation fell unevenly across the garrison, shaped by rank, by how much of the wider strategic picture a man had access to, and by how honestly he was willing to confront what his daily labor actually meant. Imamura and his senior staff maintained the outward forms of military routine as deliberately as they could: unit formations, scheduled drills, officer inspections, in part because that structure prevented the kind of psychological collapse that isolation and uncertainty could produce in a large group of men without a clear sense of purpose, and in part because maintaining the appearance of an operational fighting force remained consistent with the official position that their situation was temporary, rather than permanent. Below that level of enforced routine, something else was happening, an informal culture that grew up around the shared work of staying alive, and that cut across boundaries the formal military hierarchy had never been designed to cross. Army infantry, naval aviation crews grounded with nothing left to fly, construction troops, medical staff, men who under normal circumstances would have had almost no contact with each other, found themselves working the same fields, hauling the same nets, standing side by side over the same failing irrigation channel, developing a kind of practical dependence on one another that no order from headquarters had created, and that no order could have created. There was also an intelligence picture forming inside the garrison, assembled the same way the larger truth about their abandonment had been assembled, piece by piece from fragments the men were never officially given. Intercepted radio traffic, the pattern of aircraft passing high overhead, moving in a direction and at an altitude that had nothing to do with Rabaul at all. Occasional accounts that made it through the blockade from men who had traveled from other parts of the shrinking Japanese perimeter and carried with them fragments of a wider war picture that painted a far bleaker outlook than anything the garrison's own commanders were prepared to say officially. Soldiers traded these fragments quietly, weighing them against the official briefings, building a private understanding of their situation that increasingly diverged from the version they were required to repeat during inspections. By the closing months of 1944, the men of Rabaul occupied a strange and unprecedented position within the broader story of the Pacific War. They were soldiers stationed inside a fortress that no longer had any military function. They were members of a garrison still technically engaged in a war they had not conducted a meaningful offensive operation in for well over a year, with no realistic prospect of doing so again. They belonged to an empire that continued to describe their position as vital to national survival while providing them, month after month, with steadily less of what survival actually required. And they had, almost entirely on their own initiative and through their own improvised labor, kept themselves alive against odds that the caloric mathematics alone said should not have been survivable. What none of them yet knew was how much longer that improvisation would need to hold, or what kind of world would still exist on the other side of it when the waiting finally ended. For now, the fields kept producing, the boats kept returning with their catch, and the fortress that had been built to fight the largest battle in the Pacific War continued instead to do something no doctrine had ever prepared it for. It simply endured, one harvest and one ration line at a time, while the war it had been designed to fight moved further away with every passing month. Then, in the final weeks of that same year, The men of Rabaul found a new kind of evidence to weigh against whatever their commanders still told them officially, and it came from directly overhead. Formations of American B-29 bombers began passing across the sky above the peninsula, at altitudes that put them well beyond the reach of anything the garrison's anti-aircraft batteries could still bring to bear. These aircraft were not coming for Rabaul. They were flying north, toward the Japanese home islands themselves, on missions that had nothing to do with the fortress below them, and everything to do with a war that had moved past it entirely. Soldiers who had once scrambled to man their guns at the first sound of engines now simply watched the contrails cross the sky and disappear toward a horizon that had nothing to do with their own war anymore. The distance between the men of Rabaul and the decisive battles still being fought was no longer measured in miles. It was measured in strategic decisions already made and already being carried out, entirely without them. There was a particular quiet to those final months that veterans of the garrison struggled afterward to describe to anyone who had not lived through it. The war, as most soldiers understood it, was supposed to be defined by noise, the roar of engines, the crack of artillery, the shouted orders of an assault underway. What the men of Rabaul lived through instead was the opposite, a war experienced almost entirely through its absence. Meals eaten in silence, broken only by the sound of rain on tin roofing. Long stretches of the day spent bent over rows of sweet potato vines with no enemy in sight and no order to expect one. Evenings when the loudest sound on the entire peninsula was the surf against the reef, the same surf that had once been drowned out by aircraft engines and anti-aircraft fire. Men who had trained for combat found themselves instead becoming experts in patience, in rationing, in the particular discipline required to keep working a field day after day without any assurance that the effort would ever be rewarded by anything beyond continued survival. They were not alone in this particular kind of abandonment, though for a long time few of them knew it. Scattered across the shrinking edges of the Japanese perimeter, other garrisons had been left behind by the same strategy that had bypassed Rabaul, at Truk, at Wewak, at smaller positions across the theater whose names meant little to anyone outside the men stationed there. Not all of them found the same answer to survival that Rabaul's garrison had built for itself. At some of these isolated postings, the effort to organize agriculture and rationing on the scale Imamura's command had achieved either came too late or never came together at all, and the result was a death toll from starvation and disease that climbed far higher than anything Rabaul experienced. The 17 miles of tunnels, the 4 idle airfields, the batteries that had never fired against an invasion that never came, none of it had saved the garrison. What had saved as many of them as survived was the unglamorous, unmilitary work of turning soldiers into farmers before the last of the supply ships stopped coming altogether. Imamura carried the weight of that math more directly than any man under his command. He understood, in ways he could not always express even to his own staff, that the difference between a garrison that endured and a garrison that starved had come down to decisions made early, before the isolation had fully tightened, when there was still time to convert plots of jungle into farmland, and still enough strength in the men to do the digging and planting that would keep them alive 2 years later. It was not the victory he had trained his career to win. There was no surrender ceremony to conduct, no enemy force to defeat, no moment when the fortress proved itself in the way it had been built to prove itself. What he had instead was a slower, quieter kind of accomplishment, measured not in ground held, but in men who were still breathing when the war finally, after 2 years of silence, came to find them again. Word of Japan's mounting defeats elsewhere reached the garrison in fragments throughout the final year, carried by intercepted broadcasts and by the rare traveler who managed to cross what remained of Japanese-held territory in the region. None of it was officially confirmed. None of it needed to be. By the summer of 1945, most of the men working the fields around Rabaul understood, without anyone in authority ever saying so plainly, that the empire they served was losing a war on a scale that made their own 2 years of waiting feel almost like a separate and smaller story unfolding on the margins of a much larger catastrophe. That moment arrived in August of 1945, not as an attack, not as the invasion the garrison had spent years preparing for and had long since stopped expecting, but as a message relayed through official channels informing them that Japan had surrendered unconditionally. For a garrison that had built its entire identity around discipline, resolve, and a readiness to fight to the last man in defense of the empire, the news landed with a strange and disorienting weight. There would be no final battle. There would be no chance to prove, after everything they had endured, that the fortress could have held against anything the Americans might have finally sent against it. The war that had bypassed them in 1943 now ended without ever circling back, and the men of Rabaul learned that the empire they had waited 2 years to serve had already ceased fighting on their behalf. Imamura received the surrender order and complied with it fully. In September of 1945, he formally surrendered the Rabaul garrison to Australian forces in a ceremony conducted with the same rigid formality that Japanese military culture demanded, regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. Australian officers who took part in accepting that surrender later described a garrison that had maintained visible military bearing and discipline throughout the process, despite everything the men had endured over the preceding 2 years. It said something important about what the isolation had and had not done to them. It had not broken their discipline. It had broken almost everything else: their supply lines, their strategic purpose, their connection to the war they had trained to fight. But the formal structure of the military they belonged to held until the very end. The physical condition of the men who marched out to surrender told a more honest story than any official report could have. Of the approximately 100,000 men who had stood at Rabaul at the height of the garrison's strength, a substantially smaller number remained to lay down their weapons in 1945, the difference accounted for by tropical disease, by malnutrition that no amount of sweet potato cultivation had fully solved, and by the steady trickle of Allied air attacks that had never entirely stopped even as they grew rare in the final year. The survivors who did surrender were visibly thinner than the men who had arrived at the fortress years earlier, marked by years of restricted diet and unrelenting agricultural labor under a tropical sun. And yet, measured against the fate of other bypassed garrisons that had never achieved the same level of organized self-sufficiency, Rabaul's survival rate stood out. The remarkable, largely unrecognized achievement of turning a fortress into a farming society had, in the end, been the thing that kept the largest share of those 100,000 men alive long enough to see the war's actual conclusion. Repatriation took months, a slow and logistically demanding process of moving 100,000 men off an island the war had deliberately chosen to forget and back into a world that had changed completely in their absence. The Japan waiting for them was not the Japan they had left in 1942. The empire that had sent them to hold Rabaul in the name of national survival no longer existed in the form it had when they departed. The emperor, whose name had anchored every official assurance that their isolation was temporary and their mission vital, had surrendered without conditions. Cities they remembered lay in ruins from a bombing campaign they had only glimpsed from a distance, in the form of aircraft passing far overhead on their way to targets the garrison could never reach. The men who had waited at Rabaul were going home to a country that was itself only beginning to understand what had happened to it, and that understanding, for the nation and for the men returning to it, would take far longer than the journey back across the Pacific. What happened at Rabaul was not, in any conventional sense, a defeat. The garrison was never broken in battle. Its guns were never silenced by an attacking force. Its tunnels were never breached. Judged purely by the standards its own defenders had trained under, Rabaul held. And yet holding had meant nothing, because the war had simply decided not to ask it to. The 100,000 men who waited behind those guns and inside those tunnels were not defeated so much as they were made irrelevant, a different and in some ways harder outcome to accept. one with no clear moment of resolution and no battle whose outcome could be pointed to and understood. They had been the proof of an idea that changed how wars could be fought, that a fortress, however strong, could be neutralized without ever being stormed, simply by cutting it off from everything that gave it purpose and letting time and hunger do the rest. It was a strategy that worked exactly as its architects intended. The cost of it, paid in 2 years of isolation and slow understanding, was carried entirely by men who had no vote in the decision that stranded them there, and no way home until a war they had been left behind by finally ended on someone else's terms, in a ceremony they did not choose, in a country they no longer fully recognized.